So we're a bit of a double act today. So I'll be passing over to John during the seminar. But I just wanted to introduce the piece and just a few, I suppose, points to note. First of all, to acknowledge all of those that have given their testimonies and are directly affected by this. The Tuam Mother and Baby institution is and was one of 14 that the Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Inquiry looked at, as well as 4 county homes. But it's one of almost 200 institutions that could potentially be looked at in the future. So this is what we're going to look at. We're going to do a brief overview of the context now, and then we're going to focus on these 3 moments. Okay, so the origins of the institution, John is going to look at coming as it did around independence in Ireland. I'm going to look then at the 1940s because they were a really critical moment for different reasons. And then we're going to jump forward to Catherine Corless's research and why we see that as such a key moment in this narrative. And I'll just end by placing the Tuam institution in the global context. And I just want to acknowledge the team. We have Miriam is in the audience and her students who had an excellent theatre production. We have myself and John who've been involved in some of the leading of this. Mary Cunningham has done many of the interviews. And Lane Feeney's involved in the creative writing and also the educational resources. And Dr. Barry Houlihan is the archivist. And Lorna Farron has been so important in getting this story out there. And the project, for those who aren't aware, it was a grassroots project. It started in this university after a one-day event. It started quite ad hoc. We did not have any funding then. We did receive funding from Galway University Foundation. But like many projects that are, I suppose, trying to put an alternative view to that of state commissions, where you get your funding from can be a measure of, I suppose, what you can do. So quite small scale, but we've got quite a lot of attention, and at present, John and I are writing a monograph on the institution, and there's a new podcast coming out in spring, produced by Orla Higgins and Mary Cunningham, Fractured Lives. And I suppose these are one of the, you'll just see the boards here. They're actually 2 of the boards from our exhibition that we will have next year. And these are just some of the key outputs and the impacts. And I suppose for a small project, it has had a good reach. I'm going to end today actually highlighting 3 of the recent kind of modules on the junior certificate and where the project has come in there. So I'm going to pass over to John, who's going to get us into the history, and then I'm going to come back into the 1940s. So jump in there, John.
Find my slide. Hello, and thanks for the invitation to Marie. Okay, we got a slide, have we? That's good. Right. So, the institution that became the Mother and Baby institution in Tuam, and the wider system of which was a part, as Sarah has said, came into being at a time of upheaval and trauma in Ireland, the War of Independence and the Civil War. It was a time when established structures and mechanisms were being challenged and radical alternatives were being proposed. Vested interests on the sidelines were keen to retain influence and to shape whatever emerged in their own image, as it were. So as well as business and financial interests, there was the Catholic Church, which is especially important with regard to the subject today. Now, with regard to welfare provision at that time, you had a poor law system, which dated back to it's the workhouse system with its 160 workhouse buildings scattered throughout the country. A poor law partly because of its role during the Great Famine, was anathematized, and it was long recognised that it was in need of a major shake-up. Now, for advanced nationalists, for Labour radicals and others, the failure to implement needed reforms in the system was due to the corrupt influence of the political class, the dominant political class until that point, the Redmondite constitutional nationalists, as it were, who it was alleged, with good reason, had shored up their political position by giving out jobs and contracts to loyal supporters. So they wanted to keep the system as a means of sustaining themselves. Now, the slide here shows the architect's Wilkinson's standard plan for Irish workhouses from 1839. And the photo here shows the Tuam Workhouse building at the period when it was the Mother and Baby institution. So that photograph, I think, dates from the 60s or thereabouts. So that's 130 years of grim Victoriana sitting on the outskirts of Tuam. Now, the quote which you'll see on the left of the slide is from the democratic programme adopted by the Revolutionary Parliament, Dáil Éireann, in January 1919. It reflects the idealism of a generation of revolutionaries, but it didn't evidently reflect the views of all of them. For the quote on the right is from a member of that Dáil, William T. Cosgrave. But unfortunately, he was the person who, as Minister for Local Government, was responsible for reforming social provision. And in December 1922, he became head of government. So aspirations and, I suppose, reality in the two quotes here. Now, as I said, there were those who were keen to wind down the radical tone of discourse and policy. The Catholic Church was especially anxious to assert itself with regard to social provision. One can see much of the anxiety, if I can wind on my slide here. Yeah, did it. You can see the anxiety and the ambition in the pages of the Irish Ecclesiastical Record, considered to be the mouthpiece of the Catholic bishops at the time. In the years of state formation, around 1920, its contents clearly show a determination to achieve Catholic hegemony in whatever polity emerged from the conflict. The slide shows excerpts from one of many articles dealing with the problem of the unmarried mother, to use the terminology of the time. It might be considered, I suppose, as the tip of an iceberg with regard to the lobbying efforts that are taking place at that time. I don't think I need to go through the actual text. You can see that for yourself. So mother and baby institutions emerged as part of a reconfiguration of the welfare system, which was carried out in an ad hoc fashion with a variety of arrangements, reporting relationships with public authorities. It took place alongside other elements of state formation. The Mother and Baby Institution for County Galway opened in December 1921, at the time when treaty negotiations between Irish and British representatives were taking place. The priority of the Galway County Council at the time, as with other councils, was to reduce expenditure. Financial constraints at the time arose from difficulties in collecting the rates, property tax, the loss of support from the British government, and also liabilities for war damage. So costs are at the core of the debate, as it were. So in Galway, in the county, there were to be three public welfare institutions, but notwithstanding the fine language which we saw in the democratic programme of the first Dáil about a sympathetic native scheme, these were to be housed in the grim Victorian workhouses that we saw. Already the lives of the workhouse residents, inmates, had been disrupted because many of these buildings had been occupied by the British Army, while others had been damaged by the IRA to prevent the British Army using them for using them to repress the rebellious the revolutionary movement. Now, the decisions in County Galway were driven by a man called Thomas Welsh, who was a veteran Sinn Féin councillor and a university professor here in pathology. Throughout, he was in close contact with the minister previously quoted, William T. Cosgrave. Then, as I was saying, the decisions were taken by function and in consultation with the minister, William Cosgrave, who I quoted. Now, the decision on Glenamaddy as the initial location of a children's facility came very quickly. At the first meeting to discuss the new welfare scheme for County Galway, inquiries to convents, and that's a quote, on the subjects of a children's home. At the next meeting, 2 weeks later, it was announced that the facility was to be located in Glenamaddy. And this is the first iteration of the institution that became the Tuam Mother and Baby home. There was little in the way of what we'd call due diligence. It seems nobody in authority had visited the building, which was about 60 kilometres from Galway. And despite knowing that the Glenamaddy building had been burned out by the IRA just in the previous year. So it'll be all right, essentially, seems to have been the attitude. The reference to addressing inquiries to convents shows that it was accepted that religious were to be in charge, as ultimately they would be in public institutions in the county. It should be understood that there were religious sisters in situ in these institutions, in these buildings already, as it were, under the old order. While welfare and education systems established in the 1830s had been founded on a broadly secular basis, the Catholic Church had successfully lobbied politicians and governments to open them to denominational influence. In Glenamaddy, Bon Secours sisters were in place as nurses in the workhouse. County Council then placed them in charge of its so-called children's home, which was also to cater for mothers. It was immediately clear that the building was not suitable, a fact which was underlined by a very high infant mortality rate. Despite efforts of members of the County Council subcommittee, little was done to improve matters for 3.5 years until a reporter from the regional newspaper, the Connacht Tribune, published a devastating account of conditions there. The photograph there is from the report in 1924, and the quote here from the newspaper, which I hope our online people can see now, is from the article which describes the conditions there, the walls reeking of damp and long gloomy corridors, water having to be carried for the children's ablutions, no baths. These are some of the features. Thus, it was that you had the decision to move the institution to Tuam, which took place in 1925. It wasn't much of an improvement. The site chosen was the Tuam workhouse, which had been occupied by armies for the previous 5 years. First the British Army, then the Free State Army. It was the site of one of the most resonant atrocities of the Civil War, when 6 local men were executed in reprisal for the killing of a Free State soldier. So when the Bon Secours sister in charge, Sister Hortense, came from Glenamaddy to inspect the Tuam building, she saw footprints on the ground, which she was convinced belonged to the executed men. She had the site preserved where these footprints were and erected a monument to the dead men there. Through her brother, Sister Hortense had a personal connection with the struggle for independence, and moreover, members of her order, and most probably herself, were involved in visiting imprisoned IRA men under sentence of death in the previous couple of years. So it's clear that the shadow of the executed men hung over the Tuam Mother and Baby institution during the following decades. And one wonders why a woman who was so solicitous about memorializing the executed anti-treatyites was so cavalier with the remains of the hundreds of infants who died under her jurisdiction in Tuam. It has also been noted that her congregation was careful to reinter Bon Secours sisters buried in Tuam when they finally left the town in 2002. The Tuam building was primitive, floorboards having been used as firewood by the soldiers, and with barbed wire in the grounds. Evidently, the sisters gave it a spring clean, but the public authorities, county council and government department were slow to address structural deficiencies. There was a persistent stench from a pool of raw sewage, already identified as a health hazard, but it took 12 years until 1937 to have that remedied, and 20 years till 1945 before a reliable water supply was provided. I'll hand back to Sarah to take up the story from there.
Thanks, John. And we can all see slides. Okay, so I want to actually address what life was like for individuals, particularly in the 1940s. So I'm going to refer to some oral history accounts, I'm going to refer to some newspaper records, and I will refer to some of the evidence from the Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Inquiry. So in total, 2,219 women were admitted to the Tuam institution over the 40-year period it was operating. Now, you can see the applications rose and peaked in the 1940s, which is why I've decided to look at this decade. 1946 was the highest. And if we take, for example, in 1960, there were only 29 women admitted in that year. So who is involved in the admission of women to the institution? For those whose records do exist, the most common intermediary listed was the local health authority or the dispensary doctor or medical officer. Oral testimony has also revealed that many cases involved the family consulting with the local priest, who would then have made the initial approach to the local health authority. This could be a priest in any of the areas of Galway, Mayo or Clare, where women entering the institutions came from, or a priest that was trusted by the family. Now, I'm going to refer to one of the oral history testimonies, Peter Mulryan, and Peter recounts his mother's situation. Once her father was told she was pregnant, he called the local parish priest, who advised her to bring her to the county home in Loughrea, followed by a transfer to Tuam after his birth. And I think Peter's life story and that of his mother's reflects a range of experiences for women and children in the institution. Peter was born in the maternity hospital of what is now University College Hospital Galway in 1944. His mother was one of 5 siblings, and she was 33 years of age when she found out she was pregnant. Peter says that, quote, a single mother to be, she was regarded as a scandalous woman in her village, and the parish priest arranged for her to go to the county home in Loughrea when she was 7 months pregnant, and a few days after his birth, both he and her were transferred to Tuam. His mother was kept in Tuam for 1 year before she was transferred back to the county home, where she worked as a domestic servant. His life with his family when he was fostered out was extremely difficult, and he's spoken about this publicly and to our project, both physically and mentally. His mother, meanwhile, spent 10 years in the county home, and while there became pregnant again, and she was again sent to Tuam and later on sent to the Magdalene laundry in Galway. Now, why I'm citing that is those connected institutions and that connected story is something that we are looking at in the project. Institutional records relating to children in Tuam show that 84 mothers were admitted to a Magdalene laundry sometime after their discharge from Tuam. The Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Inquiry states, quote, "It is most likely that these women were on their second or subsequent pregnancy and in line with Galway County Council policy were directed to enter a Magdalene laundry when they sought public assistance." Now, Jim Smith has been doing amazing work, as has Justice for Magdalene's research on the Magdalene piece. But because of, I suppose, the theme of the seminar, I wanted to draw attention to this question of the very derogatory term second offenders. So particularly the Secretary of Galway Board of Health. So this is an extract from the report on the Commission of the Relief of the Sick and Destitute Poor from 1927. And you can read that quote yourself now. But the focus on women who became pregnant a second or a third time seems to have really occupied the minds of some of those in the Galway region. And I think the question of this is something that really connects the different institutions. So connects women from Tuam to Loughrea to the Magdalene Asylum. So I think that's an important piece to follow up. The 1940s was one of the most pressured decades for the institution, but also a time where we have access to the largest number of oral testimonies. Walter was born in the Tuam Mother and Baby home in 1941. At the age of 6, he was boarded out to a family near Athenry. While he was never reunited with his mother, he met a sister a year younger than him that he did not know, who lives in the United States, and it resulted from DNA research. Now, what's so interesting, I suppose, about Walter is he was working in his daughter's barbershop when he met PJ Haverty, who a lot of people may know of, and the men became very close, particularly when they found out they had both been in the Tuam institution at the same time. The home experienced its highest recorded admissions in 1943, with 143 births or new arrivals. Overcrowding drew the attention of the Department of Local Government and Public Health Inspector, Miss Clandillan, in 1944, who advocated for an expanded boarding out or fostering system. She was quite an interesting figure, and if you look at the history of institutions more generally, herself and Miss Murray were known as the lady inspectors, so they were also involved in the industrial school system as well. In 1945, calls were made for the installation of central heating to mitigate high infant mortality rates. And by 1947, infectious disease outbreaks necessitated urgent public health interventions. That was the highest. If we look at infant mortality, 1946 and 47 were key years because of in particular, a measles outbreak. Financial strain was evident in December 1947 when Sister Hortense, the still then Mother Superior, appealed for an increase in the weekly maintenance. So what of the children in the institution? A total of 3,251 children were born in or admitted to Tuam, peaking in 1946. Around 2/3 entered with their mothers, according to the Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Investigation, and the remainder were, quote, unoccupied. Without seeing the records, it is impossible to understand each of these individual cases, but we can build a picture of what life was like in particularly overcrowded moments. Occupancy, if you can consider 268 children in the institution that John has shown, and the women that are looking after them. And one of the pieces that we're looking at, or I'm looking at the moment, is actually the women that were in the institution who grew up in it, who then stayed there and worked as domestics for the rest of their lives. So I'm going to speak about one in particular now. I'm going to speak about Julia Devaney, who Catherine Corless has very kindly given us access to Julia Devaney's tapes, and her life story has been written about by individuals like Alison O'Reilly, the journalist. But Julia was born in Inaugural, County Galway in 1916. In 1923, she was placed with the Bon Secours nuns at Glanamady Workhouse and was moved to the Mother and Baby Institution in 1925. She went to the Convent of Mercy Primary School and spent a few years in the Mercy Secondary School, but did not finish her secondary education. Now, until 1961, Julia worked as a domestic servant in the Tuam Institution. So she was there when the doors were closed. She worked for 2 years as a servant at the Bon Secours private nursing home in Vicar Street in Tuam. And in 1963, she left that job to marry the widower, John Devaney, county council employee who used to do occasional repair work in the institution. Now, the tapes that I mentioned in the 1970s, the local shopkeeper, Rebecca Rabi Milan, and the tapes of these interviews of Julia. And you see this quote here. The first quote is about one of the other women who left the institution, Eileen. And the second quote, Julia worked a lot in the garden. So there's two things about this quote. One, her absolute love for that work. But the second piece is, I suppose, the range of foods that are being grown at this time. So Julia was not the only worker who spent their earlier lives in the institution as a child. Eileen, who Julia speaks of often in her interviews, developed a bond with one of the sisters who would take over the institution after Mother Hortense, Mother Martha. She says she liked Eileen. Like Martha was very nice to the children. She liked children. And I know Eileen used to kind of help her with the children. She and I would go down to the school and she'd mind the children's clothes and dressing. She liked Eileen. And I think it was because of that she helped her get to America. I mean, she helped her, not in the sense of money, because that was someone that her mother brought to help her, but with the arrangements, with the papers. She was about 36 when she left and she got on okay. She got on all right. She married. She had no children. Now, Eileen's fate, emigrating to America, was different to that of the other domestics, or certainly that of Julia. Other women that left prior to Julia included Annie Kelly and Mary Wade, both of whom had grown up in the institution. Probably a woman who has been written about, or her name at least has been described a lot, is Bina Rabbit, who was the woman that her name is on all the death certificates for the infants that died. Julia describes Bina as the housekeeper, but she was also the individual who signed all the registrations of deaths, albeit often days or weeks after they had occurred. She was given quite a lot of power and appears to have been an employee and trusted confidant of the sisters. She had a set of keys to the property, a very different position to Julia, Eileen, Mary, and the other domestics who had been raised in the institution. Julia discusses the hushed tones and closed doors when Bina and Mother Hortense and later Mother Martha were speaking. She held the, quote, secrets of the house and the senses that she had a higher place in the structure. There is little reference to her after the institution closed. I found a newspaper article that references her winning the country crafts, the stock section in the Connacht Tribune. Significantly, she sent a mass card after the death of John Cunningham's wife, who had worked in the institution in 1945, along with Mary Wade. So just briefly, I'm going to mention the sisters in the institution in my last slide. So this is another quote from Julia. You can read that in regards to Mother Hortense and Mother Martha. Historically, the sisters serving in Glenamaddy had been salaried local authority employees and received a £900 gratuity on closure of that home. However, once they were transferred to Tuam, they were no longer considered employees and relied on the capitation fees for institutional operations. So this meant the larger number in the institution, in many respects, the larger the income. The local authority continued to fund salaries for clerical and medical staff, but not for the ancillary roles like the handyman or caretaker or the sisters themselves. Capital investment in Tuam had been minimal compared to the other institutions. The Galway Board of Health never sought substantial hospital commission funding, in contrast to Pelletstown, and Tuam only received £400 for laundry and disinfecting facilities. However, children stayed in Tuam much later than the other institutions. So 5 for the boys and 7 for the girls. So they're in the institution for much longer, which was very different to some of the other homes. The Sisters of Bon Secours supplied the commission with a list of sisters who worked in the institution, but appears to be incomplete. So we have Sister Hortense, and we have some other references, but it's actually Julia Devaney's interviews that give us further insight. She remembers many of the sisters who passed through: Sister Gabriel, Sister Patrick, who visited her in the garden, Goat, the only nun who ever spoke to me about my life as an equal, Sister John Baptist, who left the convent, and Mother Anne, who was in charge when the institution closed in 1961. Sister Priscilla, Sister Anthony, Sister Celestine, Sister Leandra. She describes Mother Hortense as, quote, a big hefty woman, a slave driver with a heart of gold. She was friendly, but she still put those poor girls into Ballinsloe and the Magdalene laundry. So I don't really have time to go through this, but the other piece we're working on at the moment is the so-called putative fathers. So 399 women gave the name men when they entered the institution. And the Galway County Manager, we have 15 cases we're following up now in the civil court for maintenance. And the last piece is, I think this description in 1959 before it closed shows the absolute state of the institution just before its closure. Poorly maintained, uncomfortable, badly heated, and totally unsuitable for its 140 children aged from infancy to 6 years. Maintenance spending had been minimal for decades, with annual grants for repairs and equipment only beginning in 1957, heating grossly inadequate, furniture and play facilities scarce. Children sometimes went barefoot in unheated, bare-floored rooms, dormitories, large, undivided workhouse wards. So certainly not an institution that you would want children in. Now I'm going to pass to John. We're a bit over time. Sorry, John, and I will leave you to finish.
Okay. So this is at the point, I just take up at the point there where Sarah Ann finished, to talk briefly about the closure of the institution before I get on to talk about how a light was shone on what transpired there many decades later. So the closure of the institution, as Sarah Ann's earlier slide indicated, took place in a context of declining numbers of admissions to such institutions. It was recognised that the Tuam building was not adequate, so alternatives were explored, including relocating to Galway. With regard to renovation or reconstruction work on the Tuam building, there was disagreement with the Department of Health about the amount of accommodation required. And this gets back to the point that Sarah Ann mentioned about the age at which children were fostered. The general practice was to be fostered much earlier than they were in Tuam, so that meant that the smaller building was required than the nuns thought. Ultimately, the institution closed on the 31st of August 1961, and according to the Commission report, 52 children were transferred from there to other mother and baby institutions, to Shan Ross and Castle Pollard, while 27 went to industrial schools, and individuals considered to have special needs going to a number of other facilities. During the following decade, the building was empty, except for an occasional caretaker. Young people in the area naturally explored, robbing the orchard in season and so on. In the early 1970s, one of the young people, just to mention, a man called Kevin O'Dwyer, who was interviewed for the project, recalled seeing the dormitories and being struck by the long lines of iron bedsteads in the empty building. O'Dwyer also recalled being one of a group that organised a disco in the abandoned chapel one Midsummer's Eve, with electricity rigged up from car batteries. In the early 1970s, the building was demolished to make way for a housing estate, changing circumstances with regard to access and so on. And when children playing in the area came upon human bones in an underground chamber, it was assumed that these were victims of the 1840s famine rather than of recent times. That might have been that, but for the indefatigable Catherine Corless, a Tuam woman, who undertook a local history course in 2010, perhaps because her own mother had been raised in an institution, though she wasn't yet fully aware of the details. She was drawn to the Mother and Baby institution for her research project. So this was a modest start, arguably, to probably the most impactful piece of historical research in Ireland so far this century. A catalyst for Corless certainly was Michael Hessian, who wrote a letter to the local press, the local paper, the Tuam Herald, at this time. Born in the Tuam institution, he was trying to discover something about his early years. Corless made contact with them, and it was at this point, to quote her own words, I began to realise that this was far more than an academic project. As her work advanced, she became aware of the enormous extent of infant mortality in the institution, even if she hadn't yet established the full number involved. The absence of burial records pointed to the possible significance of the children's accidental discovery of human remains decades earlier. With the course completed, she submitted her research to the Journal of the Old Tuam Society, and was immediately accepted. You can see the launch of the issue of the journal, the relevant journal here. I'm copying myself. In 2000 and in 2012, and it was accepted for publication and indeed highlighted, according to Catherine's memoir, in the at the launch of that journal in November 2012. In the aftermath, though, she was disappointed that there was no follow-up or no recognition, really, of the significance of what she had found. So she resumed the research, requesting death certs for all who died in the institution. This was at her own expense, a £5 per cert, and there's 796 ultimately that she discovered. Through this process, she developed research skills, obviously, which she placed at the disposal of survivors who were anxious to trace their family background. Eventually, Corless made contact with the Irish Mail and Sunday journalist Alison O'Reilly, published the story under the heading Mass Grave of 800 Babies on the 25th of May 2014. Story was picked up by other papers nationally and internationally, prompting a range of reactions from outrage and indignation to a denial that such a thing could have happened in Ireland. One result was to bring survivors together in solidarity and, I suppose, in determination to secure justice for themselves. Again, Corless was instrumental in bringing people together. Individuals obviously contacted her to assist in finding information about their backgrounds and so on, given her profile in the history of the place. And people had previously, it emerged, and indeed in our own interviews, which Sarah Ann has referred to, some of them had spent decades in vain, in isolation, trying to establish their family backgrounds and so on. Tuam survivors, of course, aren't the only group affected. There had been concerns about illegal adoptions and ill treatment in institutions such as Shanross Abbey, Bessborough and Cork and so on. And the feature film in 2013, which some of you will have seen, Philomena, told the story of Philomena Lee and her son, who'd been incarcerated in Shanross Abbey in Tipperary in 1952. Certainly, Corless's research and the mobilisation that it prompted was the catalyst for the establishment of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes, established by the Irish government in 2015, and which delivered its final report in 2021. If there was some vindication for survivors, and their allies. In the report, there was also disappointment at elements of the process and certain of the conclusions in the final report. And I think Sarah Ann might say a few words about those. So I'll hand over to Sarah.
So just thanks very much, John. So we really just wanted to end the talk, and we'll take questions in the various forms then. After the Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Inquiry, and as many people are aware, the redress scheme, which was not satisfactory to many individuals. What is the, I suppose, role of Tuam globally now? And I suppose the Office of the Director of Authorised Intervention right now is undertaking an excavation really that has not been done anywhere else. So that is right now an incredible piece. And we really wanted to end on, we just have photographs here of Michael Flaherty and Peter Mulryan, who that excavation will be very important to them. But I wanted to end on one of the impacts that I think will ensure that this institution and others will go on to be studied. And it is the introduction of the Mother and Baby
Good girl.
into the junior cycle history. And this slide in particular, I think, is quite relevant because it actually demonstrates the, I suppose, wider context in which Tuam is developing. So between the industrial schools, the Magdalene laundries, the Mother and Baby institutions, and I think that it will lead to younger people, their families, and those intergenerational conversations around trauma, which I think are so central to, Maureen, your whole lecture series, because Tuam is one institution. It has very unusual pieces, but it is one institution, and it is part of, I suppose, a global context as well. So we need these institutional histories, but we also need to see this in its entirety, which I think this will help with doing. So apologies to everyone for any tech issues. I'm going to pass you back to Maureen before anything else goes on here. And thanks very much. And thanks to the physical audience here too.